we can do to counter it and what we've seen in the past. So as everyone is coming in, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kimberly Dudick, the CEO and co-founder of the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies. And I'm here today with my co-founder and CFO, Sophie Moon. We're hosting these Tuesday talks to further the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies' mission of bringing attention to underaddressed issues in Montana, letting you know some of the people working on them, and also giving you the opportunity to learn how to get involved if you want. You can also ask some questions that you can get answered at the end, which is great. These talks are recorded, and attendees can post questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. We try to answer as many of these as possible. This will be recorded and played later. It'll be available in a podcast format later today. And we're also going to have these broadcast on MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television, which will be a great opportunity for more people to see who's working on these issues and how to get involved. So today we're thrilled to have with us Travis McAdam. Travis directs the Montana Human Rights Network's Combating White Nationalism and Defending Democracy project. During his more than 15 years with the organization, he has researched, written about, and helped communities respond to white nationalist, paramilitary militias, and other far-right extremists. McAdam is a nationally recognized expert on right-wing extremist movements, and his analysis and writings have been featured in national and international publications. He holds degrees in journalism and sociology from the University of Montana. Go Grizz. So we're thrilled to have Travis with us today. Travis, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast.
Well, I know people are really excited to hear what you have to say, especially with an article that came out recently saying that per capita, Montana has the most, I think, white supremacist groups of any state. And we're interested to hear what you have to say. So please tell us about the work that you're doing on white nationalism.
Yeah, thanks. I think to a big extent, the work that we're doing and really that we've done for the 30 years that we've been around as an organization is really about helping communities both understand and respond to white nationalism. And I guess maybe it's a good thing to describe what I mean when I say white nationalism. What does that term mean? I think we see it in print, we see it in media articles all the time. But what does it mean? And basically, white nationalism is a political and social movement that uses racism and anti-Semitism to really promote the creation of all-white ethno-states. So, for instance, those in the white nationalist movement here in this country believe that the United States was founded by and for people of white European heritage. And so white nationalism really is about promoting efforts to perpetuate and enshrine white privilege, white supremacy, and really white dominance. But I think it's also important to understand that this movement is like a lot of other social and political movements in that it's really a large umbrella term that really can include kind of, I guess, what most people would think of as traditional white supremacist groups like the Klan, but it also includes other entities and activists that prefer to use mainstream politics and academic sounding language. And, as you mentioned, Montana oftentimes is ranked near the top for per capita, of white supremacist and white nationalist groups. I think a lot of that comes down to, we don't have very many people. And so our number tends to skew higher on the list. But the reality is that for the last 50 plus years, the hardcore white nationalist movement, so the Klan, Aryan nations, those types of groups have really targeted this part of the country as a place to try to establish an Aryan homeland. And this has been advocated on a regional level and down to a local level. So, for example, up in the Flathead, we've had white nationalists that have tried to create what they call a Pioneer Little Europe community, which is basically, an attempt to make kind of whites-only locality. And so in short, I mean, white nationalists have had a consistent, a pretty continuous presence here in Montana and, have caused problems in Montana communities. And when that happens, people want to respond. However, they can often get stuck at that first step of trying to understand who and what they're really facing. And that's one of the pieces that we try to help communities understand and provide to them, which is, these are the groups, these are the activists, these are the beliefs, trying to help them understand if what's happening locally in their community is connected to regional or national trends. And then it's kind of like once you get through that basic information providing piece, then it's about helping communities think about what they want to do for a response. And so that's really the work that we're doing today. And it's a big piece of the work that we've done for the 30 some years that we've been around as an organization.
Well, so tell us, how did you become involved in this work?
Another good question. So I have a job that your guidance counselor didn't know existed when you were in high school or college. So my interest really started while I was attending U of M. And one of my degrees is in sociology, and one of my upper level classes was a topic called Understanding Extraordinary Group Behavior, or something similar to that. And the professor really used the far right and kind of far right movements and far right groups as the vehicle for us to learn about, the sociological principles that he was teaching us. And we ended up doing these group projects where each group was assigned a different organization that was active in the Pacific Northwest. So like one group got Aryan Nations. I was in a group that ended up with the Militia Montana. And so we did these projects and presentations, pretty typical, college class type things going on. But really what that class did for me was, having grown up in Montana, I found out like there was this whole other world out there that was impacting our communities and really, with the potential of impacting them in really horrible ways, because I'm old enough that, this was shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing, where Timothy McVeigh, who, traveled extensively in militia and white nationalist circles, was the perpetrator of that. And I think that, figuring out like that there was this whole other world out there that I was unaware of, but was influencing communities, was trying to gain power in communities, really concerned me. And it happened to be through that class that I learned there were groups like the Montana Human Rights Network that, tracked that, researched that, and helped communities respond. And it worked out that a few years later, I started at MHRN.
Well, we are happy you've been there so long and you've done some great work. Thanks for that. So now I want to get more kind of into the problem that you're trying to address. Tell us a little about the kind of the history and the current state of white nationalism in Montana.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that, one of the pieces that we really do try to talk a lot about is a dynamic that we call margins to the mainstream. And that's basically the idea of how these ideas that start out in militia meetings and on white nationalist forums end up making their way into and influencing the political mainstream. And I think that that's important for a couple of reasons for people to think about. One is because it impacts policy. It impacts our government. And I mean, we all got really, a classic and very scary example of that with the Trump administration and white nationalism, where for the most part, you couldn't really draw a line where one of those ended and the other began. So there's a very real impact that these far-right ideas can end up having on policy, on how our government functions. But I think the other piece to that dynamic that's really important is I think there are a lot of folks out there who feel like, okay, so we as most of the community exists here, and like white nationalists, and I always get screwed up when I try to move my hands on Zoom, but like that we exist here, white nationalists exist over here, and there's no interconnection between the two. And the reality is there's a huge connection, and that what these groups do is they amplify and prey on and use the worst of our communities. And when I say the worst of our communities, what I mean is they seek to elevate and use racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, class inequity, any of those issues that pull our communities apart. That's what they use in order to organize and operate in our communities. And so I think that that's an important lesson for us to understand as we're looking out in our communities and trying to understand what's happening. But just like a really brief, or as you can tell, as brief as I get, because I can go on and on and on about this stuff. But back in the early 90s, when MHRN was forming, you had neo-Nazi skinheads and Klan members that were terrorizing the Jewish and BIPOC communities over in Billings. That would eventually lead to the Not in Our Town response that has become this response model that's been replicated all around the country. And then you jump forward to more recently in 2016 and 2017, and you had a white nationalist that ran a website that really ran this Nazi troll storm that was targeting the Jewish community in and around the Whitefish area, and using both online and real world threats. And then since that point, so the last 3 years or so, we've just seen a ton of white supremacist, racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic lit dropped in communities literally all over the state. And in some cases, those are clearly affiliated with an organization, and in other times, they're really not. And I already kind of talked about that, decades-long idea about this area of the country, so Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, being a place to create an Aryan homeland. So it's not really surprising that given that, and given the demographics of our state, that presence of white nationalist groups and white nationalist thought has been a consistent presence for, the 30 years that we've been around. And I mean, right now, if you look at like the Southern Poverty Law Center's most recent hate map, they had, I think it's 6 groups that they listed over the last year. Those included a couple of anti-Muslim organizations, the Proud Boys, and a few others. And SPLC does a good job, but they're looking nationally. We always feel like we would have additions to those lists that they put out for Montana. We would include a few anti-Indian or anti-Indigenous groups that are really about trying to destroy, eradicate tribal sovereignty and get rid of Native culture. We would add those to the list. We'd add groups like the American Identity Movement and the Pioneer Little Europe group, who still have activists kicking around, and a few others. But I guess, again, a very long-winded answer to say that, we've had this presence of these groups in Montana, the entire time our organization has been around, and that really continues to today.
Okay, so now I have kind of a more philosophical question. So get your philosophical hat on.
Okay.
What are these groups? I mean, you have to go with me on this, but what are the groups really trying to accomplish? Like, let's say they have these lit drops. Is it about money? Is it about power? I mean, really, we only have so much time in our day. So how does somebody decide that this is how they want to spend their day?
No, I mean, that's a really good question. And, depending on the tactic that they use, the goal is a little bit different. So these lit drops that happen, especially if they are tied to an organization, so they have an organization's name or logo or whatever on it. Generally, there's 2 main reasons that groups will drop literature. One is recruitment. I mean, they literally hope that somebody will pick up this horrible flyer that they've dropped and be like, wow, these people have the answers I've been looking for. So a piece of it is recruitment, but the bigger piece is it's about targeting people in our communities. It's about going after the Jewish community, BIPOC communities, and trying to really terrorize them, because the messages that they send are very clear, that they do not believe that those communities, along with the LGBTQ community, they don't believe that those people belong in our communities. And they want to put fear in those folks. And I mean, ultimately, if they had their goal, they would do lit drops, and these people that they target would pick up and leave. I mean, that's really kind of the overall goal is, again, this idea of creating an ethno state, or almost more like ethno state like locations, of trying to, in their words, kind of purify and get rid of these people that they consider undesirable. I think your question, and this is the one that comes up a lot, is people will say, well, wow, that lit drop seemed like it might have, been 1,000 pieces of lit, and who did they get the money from to do that, and why are they doing that? And the reality is part of it is based on the conspiracy theories that drive these movements. So when you're talking about white nationalism, there are these long-held anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that portray Jewish people as kind of these puppet masters that are using the BIPOC community to basically attack and take from white people. And so for people that have really bought into these movements, they think that they are doing something wonderful. They think that they are the ones who are going to save their race, or in some cases even they'll define it as trying to save Western civilization. And so for them, it's not about necessarily influencing policy or wanting to have a meaningful debate. It's about targeting the people that they don't like, trying to make those people scared, and really at the end of the day, hoping that those people will just leave. And that, their ultimate goal would be that they're left with only white people, only people of Northern European white heritage left in communities.
Okay, thank you for that. So tell us, what can we do? Like, what are effective ways that people can take action to fight this sort of violence in our communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, one of the main things is community education and persistence. So doing the work all the time. I frequently will say, like, every day is a good day to fight or denounce white nationalism. And it's also, every day is a really good day to talk about what we want for our communities. These groups, as I mentioned before, they like to use divisive issues that are already dividing communities. And they essentially amplify and use, these horrible characteristics as a way to recruit. And so I think that, the big piece is we need to respond when our communities face these crises that white nationalist groups use. And we need to be publicly denouncing white nationalism and armed vigilantism when and where it happens. And in doing that, we need to show public support for the constituencies who are targeted. And I think that, thinking about where and how can people sort of plug in and help change that narrative and help push back against white nationalism. And I think that there are so many entry points, because over the long term, really what we need to do is we need to push for that inclusive democracy that most of us want. We need to, push to reform those institutions and our processes, that really were based on white supremacy. And we need to work to reform those so they work for all of us. And like I said, anything that we can do to work against racism and anti-Semitism and sexism and homophobia and class inequity and all of those, what I often call like the worst characteristics of our communities, any work that we can do addressing those helps to stifle and push back on white nationalism. And I think that I often will tell communities, like, when there's a lit drop, when a group is recruiting, I think people, want to come together, they want to do something. And oftentimes that ends in a big event. There's a big rally or some other type of event where everybody comes together. And those events are really important because they allow the community to collectively come together and denounce what's happened, show support for communities that are targeted, and talk about, our vision for communities. But we also need to get away from the thought that we can have one rally and that means we've won. and we get to declare victory and go home. What dealing with white nationalism needs is people doing that tough, engaged work consistently over time. And so I think that, there are lots of ways that people can plug in and do that type of work in their communities. There are lots of different organizations that are doing that kind of work. And I think it's really just about people deciding, okay, I have a role to play in this. I want to do something. And then instead of being discouraged, actually go out and do good work in your community.
Well, we already put your contact information and the contact information for the Human Rights Network in the chat box. But if somebody is listening and not looking at the chat box, what is the best way to reach you?
So I would say you can go to our website, which is just mhrn.org. And you'll be able to, find our general email address and, can send us a note, or you can email us directly at network@mhrn.org. You can also find us on Facebook and send a message that way. We do have some local affiliate groups around the state. So I'm just going to assume, Kim, that you have a national audience that's listening to this statewide, and there will be people all over the state that hear this. But it may be that we have a local group that's already active in your area. We can also work with folks who want to start a local affiliate. We're actually doing that in a couple of different communities right now. So again, through our website, through Facebook, if you're interested in getting involved, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. And we have some great questions now. I'm going to turn this over to Sophie to ask some of the questions that listeners are asking and want answers to. So go ahead, Sophie.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Kim. And thank you so much for being on today, Travis. We do have some awesome questions popping up in the chat box and the Q&A. The first one that came in, which churches appear aligned with white supremacy groups in Montana?
I actually don't feel like I can really name specific churches at this point. What I will say is, historically, what we have found in communities is, occasionally there will be, a church on Main Street who, teaches, some ideas that definitely cross that line over into being racist. But what we've seen as far as sort of organized white nationalist activity is that oftentimes, you'll find, say, a group of people who follow something called Christian identity, which was the religion of Aryan nations, that's based on a racist and anti-Semitic interpretation of the Bible. They would move into these small communities and look for what they thought was the most conservative, kind of theologically speaking, church in town, and start attending there and then inviting members of that congregation to come to Bible studies at their house, and, kind of trying to pull people away in that respect. So, I mean, there have been some identity-based churches in Montana during our history of doing this work. I actually am not aware of any of those right now. But yeah, I mean, I will say that we do sometimes get reports from people who are like, oh, such and such a pastor from this church is saying this. And so we do get those reports. But as far as kind of what I would call like an organized white nationalist church, which in Montana have generally been identity-based churches, I'm not aware of any of those right now.
Well, thank you for elaborating on that. The next question we have, recently a former guest of this program, Representative Marianne Dunwell, was questioned while trying to speak to her resolution against white supremacy in Montana. The question goes on to say about how many groups there were in Montana and where they are located. She couldn't answer this question, and this participant is also wondering too. And then to elaborate on that question about how many groups and where are they located, this participant is also wondering if there are Proud Boys in Helena and potentially the Kalispell area.
Okay, let's see if I can unpack that one a little bit. So yeah, So during the hearing when, Representative Dunwell was asked about like the number of groups and where they were headquartered, I think most likely, and where most of, as Kim mentioned in the opening, the reports of Montana having the most hate groups per capita, where a lot of those, quote unquote official numbers generally come from is the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is, kind of the national organization, the national standard for doing that. And so on their latest hate map, they have, I believe it's 6 groups that they've listed for Montana. Like 3 of those they have communities listed for, and others of them are just listed as statewide. As I mentioned, we would generally add on probably another depending on the year, 5 to 10 other, groups that are active. I think what the internet and social media makes this a harder question to answer than it was back, 1,000 years ago when I started at MHRN. So when I started at MHRN, the internet wasn't new, but it was just like groups were finally sort of using it a little bit and putting their websites up. And so what you had were, traditional organizations that had leadership that were based in a community that had a PO box that sent out a hard copy newsletter, that you sent your dues to, and had much more what I would call a traditional membership and organizational structure. What's happened, since that time, but especially in the last 5 or 6 years, is there are so many more people who are getting white nationalist information and are taking that in and are getting it through social media and seeking it out on social media that then are going out into the world and they're acting on that, but they don't actually belong to a specific organization. And I mean, we've seen some of that if you've read reporting, about the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol in January, where, there are clearly groups like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and others who are, to a certain extent, those traditional organizations that played a role in that. But there are also all of these other people that have been, basically sort of self-indoctrinated in that, they have gone down a rabbit hole on some issue and have ended up in the white nationalist world and have started to adopt that ideology and then are acting on that ideology, even though they're not really dues-paying members to a specific organization. So that's not a great answer, but so what I would say is, in Montana, we see that reflected. We see that where, for instance, I mentioned a group called the American Identity Movement earlier. They have never had a formal post office box here in Montana. They have had a small group of activists in the Billings area. So there's kind of a mix between people that are affiliated with a national organization who may or may not have a local post office box, and then more of those individuals who basically are kind of indoctrinated and radicalized and moved to action by what they're seeing online. So there's kind of a mix. As far as the Proud Boys, we have been lucky up until probably, I would say, about 1.5 years ago, that we've had Proud Boys in Montana, but not very many of them. And they tended to leave the state. They would go to Seattle or they'd go to Portland or wherever, to sort of do their activism. They'd show up at these big Proud Boys gatherings. But over the last year, we're definitely getting a lot more reports that there does seem to be a group in Helena. There have been a few different people that have reported encountering them around town in Helena, and they're decked out in kind of the Proud Boy attire and handing out literature. And so we know that there's a group in Helena. We think there's a smaller group in Missoula, and maybe a few up kind of in the Flathead area. And so again, I don't think their numbers are huge. They're definitely bigger than they were a year ago, and it's very problematic that it seems like now they're starting to do their activism in Montana and in Montana communities instead of, basically laying kind of low while they're here at home and then going somewhere else to engage in Proud Boys work.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Just to give everyone a heads up, we have a lot of questions in the chat box. People are really interested in the subject. So if we can try to move through these questions as quickly as we can with giving comprehensive answers. That would be great. It's good to see people excited about this. So the next question, where are anti-Indigenous groups located in Montana? This person goes on to say, generally, anti-Indian groups spring up in communities located on or next to reservations, i.e. Whitefish, Kalispell, Shoto, Shelby, Cupping, etc. So kind of where are those organizations located?
Yeah, and the person asking the question is exactly right. I mean, they tend to be the most active in communities on or bordering reservations. And so, again, in the recent past, we've seen anti-Indigenous groups really the most active up around the Flathead Reservation, up around, the fight over the Flathead Water Compact, over, transferring the bison range back to the tribes, and around some of the hunting and fishing issues up there, but have also seen similar groups over in and around the Blackfeet Reservation, and I think where we tend to see those groups the most is those groups are really about two things. They're about trying to eradicate tribal sovereignty by basically ignoring treaty rights, and then kind of the second piece is trying to get rid of native culture by making Indigenous folks assimilate to white culture. So normally where you see those groups active is anytime you see a tribal government that's really trying to exert its treaty rights, exert its tribal sovereignty, that's generally when you see the non-Indigenous folks, get very active and start pushing back. And definitely in recent years, the most activity we've seen has been up around the Flathead Reservation, but clearly, it's gone on in other communities as well.
Thank you for that. Has anyone taken a look at law enforcement groups that have recently built up during the Trump administration? This participant goes on to say that they attended a Back the Blue car parade as a photographer, and maybe is wondering, what's the relationship between this issue of white nationalism and white supremacy we're talking about and Back the Blue and these kind of law enforcement groups around the Trump administration?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm trying to think how to answer it shortly. So I will say that back during sort of the Back the Blue, the height of the Back the Blue events, what we did see were paramilitary militia groups encouraging their members to go to those types of events. And I think that, overall, when you look at this country and how our systems and institutions have been set up, they are grounded in white supremacy. They are there to benefit white people. And so I think that there is that connection. But yeah, I mean, we definitely did see, I guess here's the way that I would say we saw those events playing out. We didn't see hardcore white nationalists that we knew planning Back the Blue events, but we did see militia members and other folks kind of in those circles attending those events and encouraging people to attend those events. And so there was definitely, some crossover there that happened.
Thanks for that. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of lump some of these questions together that are in the same groups. A lot of questions are coming in about the legislature as well as Montana law enforcement. So what can you say about, how prevalent is white nationalism in our law enforcement in the state and also the legislature? There's also questions about, some really obvious anti-minority, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bills that are being brought by really right conservative legislators in our state government. Have you guys been watching those hearings? Have you been participating? Like, what has your involvement looked like there?
Yeah, so we've been very engaged in the legislative process. We're members of something called the Free and Fair Coalition, that is the coalition that's been doing a lot of the work around the anti-trans bills that have been introduced. So yeah, we've definitely been very active. We've also been active around a lot of the bills that are trying to basically take authority, final authority for public health measures away from local county health officers and county health boards and giving that to county commissions, which is part of what we've seen militia groups advocating for at the local level during the pandemic. So, we definitely see those connections. I think, the law enforcement question is a really interesting one in that right now, because of what happened at the U.S. Capitol, because there have been instances where law enforcement officers and military personnel are found to have, engaged in that insurrection activity. I think there is a lot of push right now for both the military and law enforcement to really take active, basically take some sort of action to try to make sure that those folks aren't serving. And I mean, we get reports every once in a while about things that individual law officers will post on, on their Facebook pages and things like that. But I do think that, it would be really great to see, like the Montana Sheriff and Peace Officers Association take that issue on and, maybe come up with some sort of a process or recommendations that they could then, give to law enforcement in the state to try to deal with that issue, because I think that there is a credibility and an integrity issue there right now that does need to be answered. I think, again, going back to the legislative piece, so many of like the far right Republicans that are introducing some of these bills, again, they are an example of that dynamic I talked about earlier of margins to the mainstream, where they're taking these ideas that sort of exist out in, the white nationalist and militia world and bringing them in and figuring out ways to, turn them into proposed legislation that, is being brought forward and debated. I would say to folks now, if you're worried about those types of issues, definitely go to our website and sign up for our email list, because we, like quite a few other groups, are doing kind of weekly updates about what's going on at the session, what's coming up next week, where and who people should be contacting. So I think, obviously, the more people we have involved and engaged, the better. So, feel free to sign up for our list on our website.
Great. And I'm just going to ask one last question. Thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. It's been a really interesting conversation. So last question. A young woman posted on Facebook a few weeks ago how a group of Proud Boys surrounded her and her friends at an outdoor spot in Helena. It sounds like her and her friends were trying to have a civil conversation with them, but the Proud Boys became increasingly physically intimidating. How best to handle kind of a scary situation like this?
No, that's a really good question. I think one thing to keep in mind, like when you're in a situation like that, is a lot of the people in that Proud Boys group have a worldview, and they view what society is and how it works and what's going on in a radically different way than most of us do. And so trying to have a civilized conversation and trying to have a discussion about ideas and philosophy and political action and those types of things generally isn't going to go well, because when they look out in the world, they don't see people, for instance, who have politics like mine as being somebody like, oh, well, we're gonna talk about policy and we're gonna figure out, like, both of us are gonna compromise and like we're gonna try to see where each other is coming from, and sort of those types of interactions aren't the way that they approach situations like that. I mean, they see people who don't agree with them as enemies, and so I think that it can be difficult in those situations to have what a lot of us would consider kind of a rational discussion of ideas. I think that you're more apt to have a little bit more success with that if it's one-on-one with a person that you might already have some kind of a relationship with, whether it's a family member, a friend, a coworker, a friend of a friend, but more in a one-on-one situation than trying to debate a bunch of members of one of those groups in a public setting like that. More often than not, it's like it gets heated very quickly, and it can all of a sudden feel like a pretty unsafe space to be in.
Well, thanks for answering all those questions for us. I know it kind of got a little heated in the end, and I really appreciate you sticking it out with us and answering all these awesome questions. I am going to turn it back over to Kim for the final 4 questions of our talk.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Travis. And thank you, everyone, for putting in all those great questions. Before we go into those final 4 questions, I just wanted to, one of the things that came up, and I'd like to hear Travis' thoughts on this, is that I would encourage everyone to reach out to our great new president, as well as Senator Tester, and ask that we have a U.S. attorney for the District of Montana appointed who has experience dealing with these sorts of groups and who is committed to monitoring them and combating the hate and the violence that they perpetuate. So that is something that you can do as a listener and ask others to do to raise this. I mean, Travis, would you agree that that's something people should do?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is I think that often we can get to this position where we feel like this is a law enforcement problem. And while I think law enforcement can be part of that solution, I just always like to encourage people to remember that community piece, that taking action in your community, that community education, that type of work needs to be a huge part of the strategy as well.
Yes, thank you for that. I totally agree. And I would encourage everyone to reach out to the Montana Human Rights Network, email them at network@mhrn.org. If you didn't get your questions answered today, or if you have more, please do that, because these are really important issues that you can have a real impact on. And I'd also like to, and Travis will probably circle back with you on this, but we have through the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies something called our Local Impact Program. And one of the things we have is actually what Representative Dunwell's resolution on declaring white supremacy and as terrorism and those people as domestic terrorists. That's based off of a template resolution we have for people to pass in their own communities. And so this is part of that, bringing communities together. We can't just have one-off events, and we have power outside of the legislature that only meets every other year for 4 months to take real action in our communities. So that's up to us to do. These hate groups may be vocal, but anyone listening now and any hate groups listening, we outnumber you, and we're going to win because we're on the side of right. So with that, Travis, I'm now going to ask you the final 4 questions, intended to let people just know you a little bit more. What's a podcast that you're listening to that you'd recommend to others?
The one I always recommended, I'm not listening to it right now, but I've went back and listened to it multiple times, is one called Bundyville, that is about basically the militia family that ended up having the armed standoffs with the federal government, both in Nevada and Oregon. And I think for the folks that want to get really deep into something and try to understand what happens and what leads to those, it's a great podcast.
What is the name of that again?
Bundyville, so Bundyville.
All right, thank you. Now, who's your favorite singer?
So I am most definitely somebody that came of age during the 1990s grunge revolution, and so I have to say I generally go with the late, great Chris Cornell.
All right. And where's your favorite place to go in Montana?
That's a tough one. There's so many great places. I would generally say the Mini Glacier area and Glacier National Park, both for the beauty and hiking and just kind of for sentimental reasons as well.
And what's the best advice that you were ever given?
So I had to clean some words out of this. I've heard it expressed a few different ways with a few 4-letter adjectives that I kind of worked out of it. But I think really it comes down to you need to be an active participant in your own life. I think that's the best advice I've ever been given.
No, you aren't your own director. You're going to let somebody else. So that's definitely great advice. Well, Travis, thank you so much for the work you're doing, for being here with us today, and for being so open to continuing to work with people. who are interested in this. To everyone listening today, thank you for listening and participating. We're hosting these talks to provide an opportunity for people to hear more about different people and organizations in our state and to learn how they can become more involved in shaping their communities. So Travis, thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Great. And anyone who wants to reach out to us at the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, if you have ideas of other groups or people you would like us to feature on our Tuesday Talks, please reach out to us. We're on Facebook at Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, Twitter at Policy Rockies, Instagram at PPI of the Rockies, and email at info@pipper.org. So reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, everyone. Travis, thank you for your work. And everyone, thank you for the great questions today. Have a great day, and let's keep moving Montana forward together.